about what's right here in our backyard, and so we're just really grateful that Trey could be here. We do actually request that you guys would sign in or out, however you want to look at it. We'll save this for the end though, so you can give Trey all your undivided attention. And I'm going to put it right here. And if you don't sign it, I'll probably make up names and.
Well, I guess I can go ahead and turn the lights off so we can see a little bit better. There we go. And yes, I'm Trey Fletcher. I do work with the Atlanta Botanical Gardens.
Can we turn this one off too, please?
Oh, certainly.
Yes.
There we go.
Perfect.
So yes, I work for the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and my primary position there is the curator of the succulent collection. So I take care of the desert plants, but southeastern coastal plain natives are a particular focus of interest for me. And so I've been working there for 9 years now, and I've enjoyed it tremendously. And I finished my master's degree in 2009 at the University of Florida in interdisciplinary ecology with a focus in environmental horticulture. And if anyone had asked me what I wanted, why I wanted to get a master's degree in ecology, I would have said that I would like to return to where I'm from and work on preserving the Torreya tree, because I grew up in the area. I spent a lot of time hiking and camping in Torreya State Park, and it's always just been a very special place for me. And when I started at the garden, I had no idea that the botanical garden was deeply involved in the conservation of the species. So it was just a very sort of happy coincidence that I just stumbled into a job that's allowing me to do pretty much exactly what I'd always had dreamed of doing. So we started in 2018, and that was before Hurricane Michael. And Hurricane Michael, of course, has changed just about everything about how the project is proceeding. But this is Torreya taxifolia. This is actually, now this would be considered a fairly large and very healthy tree. They once grew to be about 50 feet tall with a 50-foot spread of branches, and were one of the major mid-story components of the forests along the Apalachicola River. But as we'll see shortly, that has also changed dramatically. The tree was first discovered by Hardy Bryan Groom around 1834, or Croom, I'm sorry. His family owned a plantation at Rocky Comfort, and he spent a lot of time in the area, and he noticed that the vegetation along the eastern bank of the Apalachicola River was unique and very interesting, and he sent samples, and it corresponded with the botanist John Torrey, and it was John Torrey who recognized that the Torreya species was new to science and was very unusual. And it's one of the common names is stinking cedar, and this is very well earned. It's a strange thing. It smells a little bit like pine sol at first, but the longer you're exposed to it, the more obnoxious the smell becomes. Having spent
Welcome.
Where the link comes from?
that's fine. So I've spent some time collecting seeds, and I had to drive back from Blairsville, Georgia, where we had some trees that we found some trees with seeds on them, back to Atlanta with several 5-gallon buckets full of the seeds in the car. And I thought I was going to pass out by the time we got back. It was really intense, and some people don't seem to be affected by it at all, but I found it to be really intense and very obnoxious. So gopher wood, of course, is another common name for the tree. So the historical range, this is a map of just this is of Alabama, Georgia, and the panhandle of Florida. The trees have been found a little bit here, just over the line in Georgia, and then along the eastern bank of the river all the way down to about Bristol. And then you can see there are some stream valleys here, and they have found Torreya trees all the way, if this is Greensboro, along Flat Creek. They've been found almost all the way to Greensboro. So it was once locally common here, but of course now, whereas there were millions of trees at one time, there may now be less than 1,000, probably more, not more than a couple of, or just under 1,000 trees remaining in the wild. So it's mostly found in an environment type or an ecosystem type called a steep head ravine, which is a deep gully with very often a beautiful clear running stream at the bottom. And these valleys have sort of etched their way back into the sandy uplands over time. And the forests within are very diverse, and there's a very thick canopy, and it forms what we call a microclimate. So that's much cooler and more moist than the surrounding area. This is a great picture. This is some property that's now owned by the Nature Conservancy, just north of Bristol, actually. And you can see that these are the steep head ravines. So this area here, the lighter colored area, these are the uplands, which were once planted in sand pine and loblolly. And the Nature Conservancy has cleared a lot of that off and is in the process of restoring it to its original longleaf pine. But these deep gullies, these steep head ravines, are remarkable not only because of the unusual microclimates, but the trees there, you'd almost feel like you were in the mountains. There are a lot of temperate tree species, and the understory is often, sort of subtropical. So you get a strange and interesting blend of temperate and semi-tropical vegetation growing in the same place. And so you've got several different plant species like the Torreya and the Florida yew, which are native to just this sort of environment, but there are also different animal species. There are some salamander species that are found only here and some crawfish species which are found only here. So it's a sort of a center of biodiversity that's just right in our backyards, basically. So this is a nice view of Torreya State Park, just down from the campground and the Gregory House, where you can see these are the temperate trees and then some of the subtropical understory vegetation. And the Torreya would have formed sort of the mid-level canopy within this forest, whereas now, of course, that's absent. But it's absolutely beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth as far as I was concerned. You've got these beautiful cypress swamps next to the river, and then the bluffs begin, and the topography can be very, very dramatic. This is me standing against the bluff. So there's several hundred feet in elevation change, and there's some limestone outcroppings here, and you'll see all kinds of amazing ferns and oak leaf hydrangea and Florida yew and Florida Torreya, and just a whole range of tree species and plant species that you won't see anywhere else. There's another view. Again, this is at Torreya State Park. So this type of forest was once called a beech magnolia forest. It's now known more generally as a temperate hardwood forest. So this is the American beech, which is it's close to the southern limit of its range in this area. And as the climate has warmed, we're seeing them regenerate less and less frequently. And these are needle palms, which are it's one of the more hardy palm species, and you can't really see it very well, but the base of it is covered by wicked clusters of spines.
Trey, are these pictures before or after?
These are pre-Hurricane Michael.
Okay, this is the good news. That's
Right.
the good news.
Yeah, these are the before pictures.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the local legends, and one that is more familiar to a lot of people who grew up here, is that this was the original site of the Garden of Eden. And so E.E. Calloway considered it to have been the original site of the Garden of Eden, based on the geography and his opinion that the Apalachicola was the only as he put it, four-headed river system in the world, and because of just the arrangement of the river and its tributaries, and due to the presence of the gopher wood, or the Torreya, which, according to Genesis, is the wood from which Noah constructed the ark. So, which is an interesting idea, except for knowing how badly the thing smells. If you imagine an ark built from this wood and then stuffed full of every animal in the world, it would have been.
That's why they needed the pine sol.
Right. So he did actually, he developed a roadside attraction just north of Bristol based on his beliefs on the land now owned by the Nature Conservancy, and the trail is still called the Garden of Eden Trail. And here's some pictures from this is from the basically the Florida archives. And I remember this, I believe that the gateway is still there at the entrance to the Nature Conservancy property, and it's still called Garden of Eden Road. And of course, he was quite a character, and he's dead certain that he knew precisely where Noah made the Ark of Gopher Wood. And here it says, the leaves of gopher trees is a perfect design conveying a special divine message. No other tree in the world has such a message. And of course, he knew exactly the precise birthplace of Adam. And this is hard to read, but it says, ladies, on this natural operating table, God took a rib from Adam's side and made Mother Eve. So he knew exactly where all of it took place. So this is a great picture from around 1950. This is a Torreya tree. And this one is exceptional because you won't see a tree in the wild or even any other trees I've seen in cultivation that are as large as this one is. And this was not considered to be a particularly large example. So it would be fantastic to see one of this size now. Although, unfortunately, well, hopefully, maybe we'll be able to see that in the future, but you won't see very many examples like this, certainly not in its home range.
Where did that picture come from?
That was another one from the Florida archives.
Oh,
And I believe it was taken at Torreya State Park.
okay.
So this is Mr. Calloway, and
that one and see.
okay, so we're going to see if this is a short video where he talks a little bit about his beliefs, if we can get it to play.
Nope,
Oh,
undo. Run back to the beginning.
that's okay. We were worried that we weren't going to be able to get the
It
video.
doesn't have quite enough, strong enough internet service because you have to push the button one more time and see if it'll start. You have to give it a second.
No, this one.
That one. And then just wait a second and see if it'll start. If not, this video, I'll give Jane the link to it, but it is posted on YouTube if anybody wants to go and watch it later. It is fascinating.
It's fascinating.
We
He's
started earlier, didn't we?
I had it going, but it seems like it's being a little bit fussy.
He'll have you believing it.
Hello.
Video. You'll start believing it.
Oh yeah, because he speaks with absolute authority and with unshakable certainty.
What I can try to do is I can try to start it at the end when Trey gets finished.
Yeah, that might be a little bit
and
better.
see if it'll play.
And if Libby sends me the link, I'll post it on Facebook on our page, so everybody can watch it.
It's definitely worth a watch.
I think it was filmed in like 1973, but
That's about right.
it's quite good.
And I'm not sure for who filmed it and for what purpose, but it's fascinating. Definitely worth a watch. So all along, I've mentioned that how common the tree was. It was not to be found outside of the range that I showed earlier, but it was very common locally within that. And then starting around the 1950s, some local scientists started to notice that the trees were dying. And it took a little while to figure out what was causing it, and they had to actually name a new species of fungal blight after it, but it's called Fusarium Torreyae. And it's a fungal blight. The trees, it causes cankers or splits or wounds in the bark or the trunk of the tree, which don't necessarily kill the tree outright, but it causes it to become weakened and vulnerable to other pests and other diseases. And so the main trunk will eventually die, and you'll see the tree sprout again from rootstocks, but it's rare to see them more than 2 or 3 feet tall in the wild before those stems eventually succumb to the fusarium. I have seen them larger than that, but they tend to be in poor health and just about anything can kill that stem.
Let me interject something.
Sure.
When I was growing up, going to church at Flat Creek, they always had a Christmas tree and it's one of those.
Right, that's true. I've heard that they were used, often used as Christmas trees because they're beautiful and they look like the quintessential Christmas tree. And that people have also used them as fence posts because they were so locally common.
Yeah.
And that steamships would sometimes stop and load up the wood to use in their boilers because it's so resinous that it would burn very hot. So it was good for use in steamships, and it was common enough at the time where that would be possible. Although it's of course now has become
Smelly Christmas tree.
yes, probably the rarest tree in the world. If not the rarest, then there are very few that are more rare. So here and there throughout the state park, you'll find what we call Torreya graveyards, and that's the remains of trees that have died over the years, and you can see how large some of them were. I found this one still standing. This was on a piece of private property not far from the state park. It was it was a very beautiful winter day, and we were doing a surveying trip to try to find some living trees, and to come upon this standing alone in the forest where it had been standing for decades and decades was sort of poignant and a little bit eerie, but still very, very beautiful.
They don't rot very well then.
That's right, they don't. It's the resins within the wood are very, very resistant to decay. So this is now considered to be a reasonably healthy example. So we also would, one of the main parts of our project was we were a little bit concerned about the deer damaging the trees, because there's something about that odor that deer find very appealing. So when the antlers are in velvet and they're ready to rub their antlers and get off the velvet, they would preferably, or they would choose Torreya trees. So they would scratch and they would damage the trunks, and not only would they damage the trunks, but that would spread the blight from trunk to trunk as they would move around. And so the idea was that if we put some fencing around the individual trees, that we might be able to spare some of the younger trees from further damage by the deer. Although now I'm not certain that that did much at all to protect the trees, and it may have actually been counterproductive, because if any debris fell, or during the hurricane, of course, sometimes it made rescuing the tree from fallen debris that much more difficult, because the cage would be wrapped around. And so I don't know that it was anything more than just an exercise in futility, but it wasn't. This is Emily Coffey, who's the VP of Conservation, and she had people like me and a few of other team members to carry these massive rolls of fencing with us every mile into the forest, and then wrestle them into place. But it made us feel like we were doing something productive, and that can be just as important as actually doing something productive, I suppose.
State government
Trey.
would agree with you.
You mentioned moving the trees. Where did you put them? Just in the same forest?
Oh, well, we haven't actually taken any of the trees out. When we were trying to rescue them from fallen debris during the storm. So we didn't actually remove any living trees from the forest.
You just clean it up around?
Clean it up around them, and sometimes the cage would have wrapped itself around the trunk, or the tree itself would have, over the years, had grown through. And so, we'd have to cut the cage from around the tree, and it seemed like it was more trouble than it had actually been worth. I don't know that we actually saved any trees from being rubbed to death by deer antlers, which was the whole idea. But the main data collection efforts are to measure the tree height, the number of living stems. We take latitude and longitude coordinates, and then we note the presence of cankers caused by the fusarium, including the number, or the approximate number on the tree, and how large the largest one. And I've seen cankers can be a few millimeters in length to well over a meter, depending on how badly infected a given tree is. And then we'll take cuttings and DNA samples, and then we give it an overall assessment of health on a scale of 1 to 5.
Can they recover from that?
Very rarely. And so part of what we're doing is we've been trying to identify the degree of genetic diversity within the population of wild trees. Because if we find that there's a great degree of diversity, we may find a tree that has a natural resistance, and that might help us find a way to treat the fungal blight. But I don't think we haven't been able to determine if that's the case yet. So a lot of that work is still ongoing. But we've collected seeds. We did find about 12 trees that have been planted at a research station up in Blairsville, Georgia. And they were taken from side cuttings at some point in the decades ago and planted up there. And they had grown to these great shrub-like examples, and they were extremely healthy, unaffected by the blight, and absolutely loaded with seeds. So I led a team up one day to collect a few seeds, and I had no idea how many we were going to be able to get. As far as I knew, we were only going to be able to find a few dozen seeds. And on that first trip, I ended up collecting over 5,000 seeds off these trees. And then the next year, we got 10,000. And so we've been able to germinate some of those seeds at the garden, and then we've also been able to come down within the state park, and we've been working with some of the local landowners in the area as well to do trials where we'll plant the seeds out. We'll plant a little group of seeds, some with a cage to keep the wild hogs and the squirrels off, and some without. And then we'll attach a data collection device here that can measure the temperature and the humidity over time, and just to see how successful germinating the seeds or just growing them from seed and then across the natural range can be, how successful we can be doing that. Yes.
About, you said, yeah, you got these seeds from Blairsville. Is there
Many
a
of
place up there that we could go see?
I believe it's on
Several growing, or is there a park, or what is it?
It's on a University of Georgia extension research station. It's just outside of Blairsville, and I don't believe it's open to the public. So the trees are, it's in the mountains, so it's
Yeah, I know where Blairsville is.
right. It's a fairly isolated spot, and it's just right on the side of a hill in full sun. Because this is a species that we mostly associate with growing in deep shade within a forest, but they can certainly survive in full sun. And in the mountains where the climate is different than it is down here, they seem to have adapted very well to it. And
How big are the seeds?
the seeds are about the size of a large grape, or sometimes a little bit larger than that, maybe about the size of a walnut. And they're fleshy and with sort of a fleshy exterior. Now there are 4 species of Torreya trees known across the world. There are 2 in China, 1 in Japan. I'm sorry, there's 5, including the 1 in Florida. So there's 2 in China, 1 in Japan, 1 in California, and then the Florida Torreya. And in China, the Torreya seeds are eaten, and you can even find them canned. And I can't imagine why anybody would want to, but apparently they are known to be a food source. And the Torreya species that grows in California, the Native Americans that lived in that area were known to eat the seeds of those trees. But I can only imagine that there would have been something like food of last resort. We don't have any information on whether or not they were a significant food source for the Native Americans in this area. So it's an open question. So, but I can only imagine it would have been a food of last resort, unless there's a medicinal value that we're not aware of.
What makes those Torreya trees different than our Torreya trees?
They are much larger. They tend to be much larger. The trees that in China can be well over 100 feet tall and several feet in diameter. And one of the most popular uses of the tree, aside from timber, is that the trunks can be cut into circles. And there's a board game called Go that's very popular in East Asia. And it's a sort of a grid, and black and white stones are used to play this game. And for whatever reason, Torreya wood is the most popular wood used to make Go boards in China. So it has a number of different uses there. And the trees of those species are much larger than the Florida Torreya. And I think the California Torreya is also a fairly small species, but it's unusual to find trees of the same genus that are so widely separated from one another. So I'm not sure that it's entirely known how they became so separated over
What
time.
part of China are those trees in?
It would be in southeastern China in the mountains. So it's around the same latitude that North Florida. We're right on the 30th parallel here. And I think that it's about the same in China, but it would be at much greater elevations and deeper in the mountains. So the DNA samples and cuttings, we usually will take one from each tree that we visit and take them back to the botanical garden and put them in the greenhouse until they sprout roots, and then we'll transplant them to our safeguarding nursery up in Gainesville, Georgia. And the DNA samples are sent to a lab, as I was saying earlier, to determine the genetic diversity within the wild population, which has implications for discovering the potential for natural resistance to the fungus. So this is a little shot of our safeguarding nursery up in Gainesville. So about once a week, I'll go up and help the crew out that works there, and we'll take care of these trees and do various data collection on them. And they're now being transplanted into an actual forest habitat up there because they were sort of kept in this area for a long time and have sort of grown and tangled up with one another, and the disease can spread very easily in an environment like this. So it's all changing now, but that's an ongoing project as well. So now we come to Hurricane Michael, which of course in late 2018 sort of changed everything, and the impact on everyone's lives here was, of course, was traumatic. It was a Category 5 storm that continued to strengthen as it moved onshore. And the path of the storm paralleled the river, and that allowed the winds circulating around the eye to be funneled into the ravines. And I'll come to a picture where I can sort of show what it is that I mean. And which I wouldn't have expected this, but the uplands received comparatively less damage than the more sheltered ravine forests. So that the Gregory House and the buildings in the state park were relatively untouched, but the ravines, which I would have expected to have been much more sheltered from the winds, were completely devastated. And I can imagine that one reason that might have been if the eye of the storm was moving north along the river and the winds were spiraling around the eye. As you can see, the way that the ravines are sort of perpendicular to the river, the winds would have been sort of funneled down into those deep ravines. And that I've heard some estimates, and I'm not sure how they can really put any numbers to this, but that it could have funneled the winds to be, half again as powerful as they were, just in a straight line or in the uplands. So, but the effect was that you'd have giant trees pulled up by the roots, broken into pieces, and then piled into great, piles of debris at the bottom of these ravines. Which, the first time I came down after the storm, I went out to Aspalaga Landing and I looked around, and it took me I would have thought that I would have had a much more visceral emotional reaction to what I was seeing, but the devastation was so complete and so widespread that it took me a long time to just get my head around it. It was just hard to process. And you could smell the tree sap because there were 11,000 or so acres of more or less untouched forest there. So you had these, thousands upon thousands of acres of these giant hardwood trees that had just been torn to shreds and thrown on the ground. So it was just an overwhelming smell of all the different types of tree sap. And it was pretty devastating just to have, I'm sure that everybody here can relate. I mean, not only, just aside from the human tragedies associated with what the storm did, but just to sit there and look at this place that you had loved for your entire life and that it's just completely gone, and there's nobody to be mad at, there's nothing you can do, it's just like all of a sudden you have to just process it. And I thought it would be very difficult to come back and do more field work after that. Like, for all I knew at the time, that the entire project might have been finished, but that's not so. We've been able to go out and we've been able to revisit many of the trees and locate a lot of them. But I'll say that some trips we've come down to check on trees that we may have found 1 out of 5 still alive. You know, you would come along and we use an app where we can track the GPS location, and it will basically lead us to the location of a given tree, and you just come upon a massive debris where the tree was supposed to be, and there'd be no evidence that there was one ever there. So it went from the pictures that I showed you earlier to this, and this. I mean, photos don't really do it justice. It's the sort of thing that you have to see for yourself, and I'm sure we've all seen enough examples of that. But what really got fun was trying to walk through that too, whereas you could just traipse along through those open woods before without any problem. And now we were trying to find the location of these trees you'd have giant trees piled on top of each other, and then as the years have gone by, the wild grapes have grown over the top of that, and then the blackberries have grown up among that. So we'll be, walking along, balancing on the trunk of a tree, and the bark starting to slough off as the tree decays, and a machete is useless, and so we just take our pruners, and so we're just cut, and then step, and then pull the blackberries off yourself, and then kind of clip, step. And so just it could take hours to go 100 yards through some of these environments, and occasionally we'll find a tree that has survived, that somehow miraculously avoided being crushed by falling debris or the trunk of a tree, and at other times, like I was saying, you'll find no evidence that a tree was ever there. In this particular location, this was in the state park, not far from what we call the Old Stone Bridge. There were 2 big loop trails at the state park, one just called the Torreya Loop and the Torreya Challenge Loop, and they were connected by a trail. And I was walking along, and I saw this big tree, and then on the other side of it I saw the trail marker on it, and I realized that we were on that connecting trail, and it was totally unrecognizable. I'd walked on that trail I don't know how many times in the past, and had no idea where I was until I saw the blaze on the tree. And so here's an example of one of the trees post Hurricane Michael that we revisited, and it's pretty amazing how well they can survive being crushed by falling debris. They'll just sort of send up a new shoot, and so that if it weren't for the fungus making the tree already extremely weak, I would feel a lot more confident about the long-term survival of the species post the hurricane. But the trees being so weakened by the disease has made it that much more of a challenge to try and save it from extinction. So this is one of the steep head ravines. It's the location of one of the every single time it seems like we knew we were getting close to the tree because there would be a big pile of debris. We're like, okay, yeah, it must be under there somewhere. And so this is the Gregory House, of course, which was not damaged very much. Extremely challenging for us, but I'm fairly confident that there's a chance that the tree can survive long term. People have often said to me when I've discussed the damage to the area after the hurricane, they'll say things like, well, that's nature, and oh, it'll grow back, right? And yes, but it will never, I think, look the way that it did. That part of Florida has taken glancing blows from hurricanes, but never a direct hit from a hurricane of that magnitude in all of recorded history. So whereas in, say, South Florida, where Hurricane Andrew came across the peninsula, that was a devastating Category 5 storm as well, but the forests there are much more adapted to hurricanes. And so they were much more able to restore themselves in a relatively short amount of time. So it would be like, how long will it take before you could walk through an area like this and not tell that it had been at least 100 years? At least, and even then, there will be different species that will have come up because the climate is changing, and there are a lot more invasive species of trees that have been introduced to the area that have been given a huge head start by all this openings in the forest canopy. So in 100 years or 200 years, it may well be a mature forest again, but it won't look much like it does now. Hopefully, if we're successful in our efforts, maybe there'll be a mid-story of Florida Torreya here again. But time will tell. But I'm really I'm glad to be able to participate in that. It's been a real privilege, and I've enjoyed it tremendously. And I look forward to coming back and doing some more work along those lines, and maybe some more work with the Florida yew and with a few of the other rare plant species that we've got. And it's been also a great honor to have been asked to come and speak here today. So.
Are they allowed to have like heavy equipment come in and help with that, or y'all just have to leave it as is?
We pretty much have to leave it as is. I think that it would be, there's so much territory to cover, and on the one hand, there are billions of board feet of incredible timber that has just laying on the ground out there. You figure that it would be worth a lot of money, but a lot of it was shattered as it fell during the storm. And just the amount of money it would take to get the amount of equipment you would need to get in there and do any meaningful level of work with clearing it out, the cost would be just totally prohibitive. And it would.
In the swampy areas, they can't get equipment in there anyway.
This is true.
Even when they were logging
Right.
on our place, they had to just leave and making fire lines around. It's too wet, you couldn't do it, you had to go up around.
That's correct.
We can't walk in those woods yet.
So the challenges are huge, even under the best of conditions. And there was a little bit of a worry that, say we had a very, like a couple of very dry years after this, so you'd have what amounts to a huge amount of fuel on the ground. And I was a little concerned that if a fire had gotten in here, because they burn the pine woods in the uplands, every few years, if a fire had gotten down into the ravines with all of that fuel, the conflagration could have been so intense that it might have cooked the seed bank down to a level of about 10 feet, so that all you'd end up with would be a desert after it was all said and done. Fortunately, that has not happened. So so it's we're all we can do is do what we can. So we'll see how it all turns out. But as I say, I'm really feel very privileged to be able to be a part of.
Trey, my daughter and I sat in my living room in my dining room in chairs and watched it happen at our house, and we're just 3 miles from Torreya, from Ascalagi.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
And we were up on the hill high, and it was amazing. It was like saw cut off pine trees way up high, but these great big hardwoods, magnolia trees, all these oak trees, huge. It would lift them completely out of the ground, but didn't mess. We couldn't figure it out unless it was the canopies that caused the whirl to lift it.
I think it's some of both. Many pine trees have very deep tap roots that can sort of anchor them into the ground, such that the wind will have an easier time just snapping them off at a certain height. And a hardwood tree like an oak, the roots tend to spread out a little bit more. They don't go quite as deep.
I never would have thought of magnolia though, would have.
Right.
It just.
And but occasionally, when I've been walking around out here, you'll come to a place that perhaps the way that particular ravine twisted and turned through the landscape, that it missed the worst of the winds, and you'll be in, all of a sudden, you'll be in a place that looks like the storm never happened.
Yes.
There'll be several acres that were totally untouched, and then you can sort of still feel the old magic of the place is still there. So it's not all total devastation. There are still some really nice spots in there, and they have cleared all the trails, and the campground, I believe, is open again. So it's definitely worth going out there, even just to drive through.
Pine trees also have sap lines,
Mm.
and the tree is weak from the sap line up.
Okay.
And it's stronger from the sap line down.
So that okay, I didn't realize that. That can explain exactly where it decides where the weak point is. Okay.
20 feet of it.
So
Is there any, like a website or somewhere we could go to like adopt a Torreya tree or, I mean, is there any?
that's a great question. I don't know of any,
Okay.
but I can certainly research that.
Chattahoochee Women's Club has one growing in Chattahoochee. You can adopt it. We'll take any funds you want. We have 2 of them.
Yeah,
We got-
Can you get some and then replace them, put them somewhere else?
I don't know. You can actually buy them. I think native nurseries in Tallahassee, you can go buy them.
You could a couple of weeks ago, I saw them
Women's Club got
a few weeks ago there.
Excuse me.
So they are commercially available. There are some nurseries that
But I thought there wasn't a few of them left.
well, they probably took cuttings from somewhere and propagated them and grew them. I'm not sure how that works, but there are not many left in the wild. But people have been able to get cuttings and grow them in a nursery setting.
We
So-
got ours through you, through your botanical garden.
Yes, ma'am.
And
And so,
They followed them, I think still are, Jeanette? Yeah, we still are. We're
okay.
still following them, and they've had a lot of TLC, and they have a fence around them, simply to keep 2-legged varmints
Oh,
from
sure.
destroying them.
Now, I know that there's one of the largest still known is growing at somebody's house in Madison, Florida. And there was some
That
debate.
far over.
There was some debate as to whether that was one of the Chinese species or if that was a Florida Torreya, but I think it's been determined that it is actually a Florida Torreya. Somebody must have just transplanted it there decades and decades ago, and it has survived. And
That's,
so it's-
That's now a parsonage for a church.
oh, is that so? Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah, it was for sale, I don't know, what, about 10 years ago, the house, and, I thought about buying it.
That'd be great. I've never seen it. Like they sort of discouraged us from going over there at one point because we had been working out in the woods
Yeah,
here,
yeah.
and they didn't want us going over there covered in spores and risking any damage to the tree. So
And so there's no kind of fungicide that is it that specific that they just can't develop one?
well, it would be possible. They have actually been doing trials with fungicides to see how they work on individual trees. But as far as dealing with a wide area or like treating
It's
all
called
of the
crop
trees.
dusting. We all know what a crop
Right.
dusting is.
The problem is that fungicides are so toxic to
Yes.
people and animals as well.
Well, so will crop dusters. But,
Right.
You know,
Oh,
we
sure.
played under those.
I know, I used to load them up by hand myself. I don't know how much, like my elbows into the poisons. So, we tend to try to at least be a little safer now.
I know.
We're trying to bring cancer rates down.
A little bit, right. So there are some efforts ongoing, there's a study going on at UF right now to see if there's any sort of treatment. But I don't think any results from that have yet been
What does
released.
it look like? I mean,
It's just a black, it sort of manifests itself as just a sort of a black oily goo that oozes out of the wounds in the bark.
Is it specific to those trees, or like the dogwoods have had something wrong?
This is
with them?
true.
We used to have the woods full of dogwood.
Now, we don't know exactly the origins of it. It's suspected to have come from China because most of, if you look around, imagine that. Most of the plants that we associate with people's yards here in the South have their origins in southern China. Because at one point it was considered to be a status symbol to be able to afford exotic plants to plant around your house, and now we just associate them with everybody's house. But they're closely enough related to species that are native here that many of the diseases that affected them in China affect our native plants too, but the native ones don't have the same resistance. So it's possible that the fusarium was sort of endemic to some conifers like cephalotaxis or some of the other trees that were brought over from China, and it got into the wild that way. Much like has happened to the American chestnut, which was wiped out by blight, and the Dutch elm disease, the red
Some happened
bays.
to the mimosas too, didn't it? So-
Probably. So this is a story that's been repeated over and over again, where exotic diseases have been brought into this area. And that's even happened on a human level when Europeans first came here and introduced things like smallpox to the native population. So it's just a function of the increasing levels of globalization that diseases spread along with everything else.
You were talking about the beech tree. Is it also endangered?
I wouldn't say that. I think that studies have shown that it's starting to, that its range, as the climate has warmed, its range is starting to migrate north. And so you're starting to see them reproduce less frequently along the southern part of. That's one of my favorite trees. I love
Mine
the
too.
American beech are gorgeous
So we
trees.
have two, but they're small. They're just very, very slow growing.
They are. And this is, we're, like I was saying, we're at the southern edge of their range here, so I would imagine that over time, we may stop seeing them reproduce here at all. There still are, but maybe a little bit less frequently.
Tell me a little history of the Atlanta Botanical. How do you get your funds? Are you funded by?
It's a privately funded nonprofit, so it's almost primarily or almost entirely from private donations from citizens and from corporations. So it's no.
So you don't depend on the government giving you money?
No, ma'am. There are some in the conservation department. Sometimes grants through grant writing, we're able to get some government funding that way.
Yeah.
But primarily, it's from private citizens and from corporations as well.
You do wonderful work.
Thank you.
Can you mention your partnership with the Florida Native Plant Society?
Oh,
I saw
sure.
Lily in the photos.
Oh yeah, yeah. Lily Bird is fantastic. We've done a lot of work with Lily, and we've just been coordinating with them as far as they do a lot of surveying and on some of the private land around the state park. And I can't say enough good things about Lily. She's been a fantastic person to work with. Her level of plant knowledge is next level. She's absolutely amazing. And so we've been partnering with the Native Plant Society on a lot of this work. And so I've truly enjoyed working with Lily a lot.
Whatever, the seeds are poisonous to birds and all this kind of stuff, but they've been there for all these years.
Oh, sure. Well, there's a lot of things that we've
I think
learned
the
about.
birds must have adapted if they still eat them.
Well, sometimes that's the case, and there are some plants that, like I believe it's Ardesia.
I hate that mess.
Some people think it's pretty, but to me, it's ugly as sin.
It's pretty. It just takes over.
It does.
What,
So
is it as a blue flower or no?
No.
it's
it's
got
red.
the red berries on it, and
Big leaves.
If you don't have it in your yard, it's coming to you because
yeah, it
it's
will.
in mine.
They spread like wildfire, and birds do eat the seeds, and they spread that way.
You wanna take a look?
Oh, I hate them.
So there's a whole host of species that have, some of which are considered to be like highly invasive, that will take over a native ecosystem and sort of.
Asparagus fern is another one.
And then there are some plants that are non-native but have just become naturalized, things like mimosa or China berry, things like that. They're not quite, they don't spread quite as quickly as some of the other more detrimental invasives, but they can really disrupt a native ecosystem. One of the ones that's become really bad in this area is Kogan grass, and it spreads on road working equipment. So you'll see it start.
What is it called?
Kogan grass. It's a tall
C-O-G?
C-O-G-O-N, Kogan grass.
Okay, I have to look that up.
Imperata syndrilica is the Latin name of
That
it.
did help.
But it
Cooking grass, I can read.
spreads along roadways. Like if a grader goes down a dirt road and it's got bits and pieces of that plant on it, all it takes is a bit of a leaf or a little bit of a stem and it'll spread. And it's just a thick, sharp-edged grass that gets these little white plumes on it when it flowers. and it likes to be burned. Like trying to burn it to get rid of it does not work because it's native, I believe, to New Guinea, and you'll see it growing all over the South Pacific Islands, all over Southeast Asia, and it's spread into Australia and into the southeastern U.S. It's one of the worst of the newer invasive plants that we've seen. There are sometimes they can be dealt with biologic means. There was a really bad one called the air potato that was spreading across central Florida. That was a beetle has been introduced that eats it, and so the beetle comes in and destroys it. And the beetle itself doesn't seem to spread and affect any of the native plants. So sometimes you can use biological control of invasive species, but sometimes introducing a bug to deal with a plant can backfire terribly. Love bugs, right?
Yeah.
So there are some solutions.